Welcome to our instructional video on performance gains in counter movement jumps as compared to squat jumps through the initial force principle by Gerhard Hochmuth when aiming to maximize jumping height. This is Gerhard Hochmuth during a biomechanics conference in 2002 in Leipzig, Germany. In his seminal book in German language on the biomechanics of movement skills in sports, he outlined originally 5, later 6, biomechanical principles related to specific movement strategies that are justified by the laws of mechanics. One of his most well-known principles concerns the initial force principle in sports biomechanics. Hochmuth was a chief biomechanic in the former East German sports science community, working as professor at the German University for Physical Culture in Leipzig. Until today, he is considered, especially in Germany, as one of the most influential sports biomechanics. Hochmuth's principles are not universally valid. Depending on the individual movement technique and on the subgroup analyzed, principles may fail to provide valid predictions. The initial force principle in sports biomechanics concerns the beneficial effect of a counter movement prior to the acceleration of objects, including the own body, for maximizing their takeoff velocity. In this respect, Hochmuth's principle particularly applies to jumping skills with counter movements and to many throwing or shot putting movements as well. In order to understand the initial force principle in sports biomechanics, it is useful for students to remind themselves of issues in their previous high school physics classes. In particular, the following terms, motion, velocity, momentum, impulse, and force, are relevant. To start out with, a body or an object is in motion when changing its position with respect to time. The velocity characterizes the rate of change of its position with respect to the frame of reference. Remember, velocities are vectorial quantities, as a direction for the change in position must be considered. The momentum of the body or an object refers to its mass in motion. It is given by the product of mass times velocity. As a consequence, the momentum must be considered a vectorial quantity as well. At any given point in time, both the velocity and the momentum characterize an object's state of motion. For example, our horizontal velocity and momentum are 0 when resting in a TV chair while watching a movie. In turn, the momentum of an object may be crucial during a collision with another object. Looking at the small insect and an elephant moving with the same horizontal velocity in the same direction, for example, it would be far more harmful to clash with the elephant owing to its larger momentum. To change the state of motion in a freely movable object, in other words, to change its velocity and momentum, an external force must be applied within a given period of time. The impulse is a quantity to characterize the overall effect of a force acting upon an object over time. So the impulse is equivalent to the change in the object's momentum. For example, through his pedals, the crank, the chain, and the back wheel, the bicyclist is exerting a horizontal force Fh upon the ground to move into a forward direction. Based on Newton's third law, the ground reaction force minus Fh is acting in the opposite direction to change the velocity and the momentum of the bicyclist in a forward direction. Increases in velocity are based on acceleration impulses and decreases in velocity on deceleration impulses. You cannot see, touch, or smell forces. However, one can recognize the exertion of a force upon the body when it changes its state of motion, in other words, its momentum and velocity. A force must therefore have been exerted upon a toy car that changes its state of motion as if by magic it is moving forward. A look underneath the table reveals that the force has been exerted on the toy car via a magnet which changed the toy car's state of motion. Having refreshed the previous issues from high school physics, the mechanical basics of the initial force principle in sports biomechanics can now be better understood when applied to vertical jumps. We begin with the consideration of the vertical forces acting during a downward movement from an upright stance. In the upright stance at rest, two equally large forces opposite in direction are acting upon the center of mass while mutually cancelling out each other such that the force equilibrium is present. This is on one hand the body weight force with a downward direction, and on the other hand the ground reaction force which is directed upwards. Only these two forces are essential to changes in the vertical velocity, whereby the ground reaction force can be lower as well as higher than the body weight, depending on the movement situation. This equilibrium of forces will be broken by dynamically bending the legs such that the ground reaction force is dropping, which is visible in the curve at the top right. As a consequence, the now larger body weight force accelerates the body mass minus the reduced ground reaction force in a downward direction. In this phase, in which the ground reaction force being lower than the body weight, the downward velocity increases as indicated by the middle curve on the right hand side. The body therefore receives an acceleration impulse. In order to prevent a collision with the floor, the ground reaction force during the downward movement must be increased again beyond the body weight to decelerate and eventually end the downward movement. In this phase, in which the ground reaction force exceeds the body weight level during the downward movement, the downward velocity decreases. The body therefore receives a downward deceleration impulse. The displacement of the body's center of mass shows, at its end, how deep the downward movement was carried out into the squatting posture. If, after the downward movement and the directly following upward movement, the person returns to its starting position in upright stance, her previous force, velocity, and displacement curves expand as follows. The ground reaction force above the body weight line provides a deceleration of the downward movement until the point of movement reversal. Note, at this point in time, when the velocity of the body's center of mass is 0 and the center of mass displacement curve below reaches its lowest point, that the ground reaction force reaches beyond the body weight line. The ground reaction force at the instant of movement reversal is referred to as the initial force for the countermovement. The play-stop function of your video player provides a possibility to stop the video footage at any point in time you wish. Next, During the upward movement, the ground reaction force, still located above the body weight line, provides an upward acceleration of the body until again dropping below the body weight line. From this point on, the body center of mass is decelerated until upright stance. Note that in the velocity curve, the downward-upward movement provides the shape of a lying capital S. Moreover, as the areas below and above the baseline in the velocity time curve are equal in size, the displacement time curve on the bottom right returns to its initial level. The same is true for the force time curve. Here the sum of the areas below and above the body weight line add up to zero as well, resulting in a zero center of mass velocity at the end of the upward movement. Executing a counter-movement jump, the ground reaction force must reach levels as large as, not only to return the body to the upright stance, but to continue the upward movement to a takeoff beyond. The initial force principle in sports biomechanics implies that starting with a counter movement and owing to an initial ground reaction force at the beginning of the upward phase, a larger acceleration impulse evolves than without a counter movement. This principle applies to all movement skills with counter movements aiming to maximize propulsion, including throws, pushing movements like shot puts, and in particular counter movement jumps. Through a counter movement, at the point of movement reversal, an initial force above the body weight line is necessary to decelerate the body mass prior to the upward movement. The initial force enhances the size of the acceleration impulse, which can be easily seen in the area shaded in red between the force time curve and the body weight line, between the point of movement reversal and the takeoff point. Note that the acceleration impulse and the center of mass velocity is largest slightly before the takeoff point prior to the flight phase. Based on the energy conservation theorem in physics, the vertical takeoff velocity is directly proportional to the jumping height. This height is defined as the elevation of the center of mass between the takeoff point and the apex of the center of mass trajectory during the flight phase. Thus, jumping height h equals taking velocity v squared divided by 2 times the gravity acceleration g. Note that at the end of the ground contact phase, the force time curve is dropping below the body weight line briefly before the takeoff instant. For the remaining short period of time until the takeoff from the ground, the center of mass will be no longer accelerated. In fact, during this brief period of time, the center of mass is being decelerated, indicated by a drop in the vertical velocity owing to the larger body weight force as compared to the ground reaction force during this period of time. On this slide, the just described relationship is highlighted again with an additional graphical illustration. Only the force time curve for a vertical jump with an initial counter movement is shown here. Such jump is commonly called a counter movement jump. The reversal point is located at around 550 milliseconds after the beginning of the downward movement phase. The red area between the force time curve and the body weight line, between the point of movement reversal terminating the downward phase and the takeoff point, indicates the acceleration impulse that the jumper received at the end of the ground contact phase. Please note the difference in area that evolves with a high initial force in line with a larger acceleration impulse. See the area shaded in red, as compared to a lower or no initial force at all, shaded in gray. The last figure showed how an initial counter movement may enhance the acceleration impulse for a subsequent vertical jump and its jumping height. Without an initial counter movement, there is no initial force at the beginning of the upward phase. Given the same upward movement time, in this case, the associated acceleration impulse is therefore lower for the upward movement. A vertical jump without an initial counter movement is commonly called a squat jump. The associated force, velocity, and displacement time curves are again shown on the right-hand side. Please note that the amplitude at the end of the displacement curve is indicating which distance during the ground contact phase the body's center of mass has traveled in an upward direction. In this figure, in red, the same ground reaction force from the previous counter movement jump is displayed. Again, the baseline indicates the body weight level. As the force curve drops below the body weight line, the downward phase begins. Then, with the force curve reaching beyond the body weight level, the downward movement starts decelerating, such that an initial force will evolve at the point of movement reversal. The subsequent course of the ground reaction force is generating the acceleration impulse in the upward direction, which is illustrated by the area shaded in red. Now, the initial force principle can be nicely illustrated by directly comparing the force time curves for a counter movement jump and a squat jump. For the squat jump, the acceleration impulse is illustrated by the area shaded in blue. Now, owing to the initial force principle, for the upward phases, the area under the red force time curve of the counter movement jump is larger than the area under the blue curve for the squat jump without a counter movement. This is the gain in the acceleration impulse and thus for the takeoff speed and the jump height as well, originating from the initial force in the counter movement jump at the point of movement reversal. However, the two force time traces show another feature that is often present when comparing counter movement jumps and squat jumps of the same individual. It is quite common that the upward phase in the counter movement jump is shorter in time than the upward phase for the squat jump without a counter movement, with both upward phases starting in the same squatted body posture. Thus, the benefit of the initial force principle may be somewhat attenuated by the longer upward movement time during the squat jump. Nevertheless, in our case, the surplus of the red area owing to the initial force principle is larger than the surplus in the blue area here highlighted in light blue owing to a longer upward acceleration phase during the squat jump. All in all, the mutual comparison shows that, given the same starting posture for the upward phase, counter movement jumps may be executed with a larger acceleration impulse than squat jumps and thus produce larger jumping heights. This is also indicated by the longer flight time. To properly understand the initial force principle, it is also important to realize that the high initial force at the point of movement reversal alone is not sufficient to generate a large acceleration impulse. For example, high initial forces can be easily generated by fast, short amplitude counter movement jumps without achieving large jumping heights. Such a short amplitude counter movement jump is displayed in this video. Accordingly, here the initial force is significantly larger than in the previous counter movement jump. Comparing the two counter movement jumps based on their ground reaction force time curves, you can easily recognize that a larger initial force alone is not enough to achieve a larger acceleration impulse with a correspondingly larger jump height. In addition, the force must be also effective over a longer period of time. The comparison of the corresponding areas under the force time curves during the upward phases shows that the counter movement jump in blue with a shorter ground contact time and a shorter counter movement amplitude of 17 centimeters, but a higher initial force comes with a smaller acceleration impulse than the previous counter movement jump in red, with a lower initial force and a counter movement amplitude of 30 centimeters. The difference in the acceleration impulses and the corresponding jump heights is visible in the different flight times as well. In this last figure, the ground reaction force time traces for a counter movement jump and a squat jump are displayed belonging to an Olympic ski jumping gold medalist and four hills tournament winner. This ski jumper had reached jump heights of 50 to 60 centimeters in the performance analysis. Again, when compared to the squat jump, the upward phase for the counter movement jump is shorter in time. However, despite the longer upward phase in the squat jump, the acceleration impulse and the corresponding jump height in the counter movement jump are larger than in the squat jump, owing to the dominance of the initial force principle. Hence, this principle appears to be valid for elite athletes as well. To summarize and simplify, a large initial force alone is not sufficient to maximize the acceleration impulse in counter movement jumps. Short amplitude explosive type counter movement jumps show very large initial forces but do not provide large jump heights. For an ideal situation, the initial force principle properly applies to a counter movement jump with a counter movement amplitude depicted by the individual to maximize jumping height. This jump will be typically compared to a squat jump, starting with a similar body posture prior to the upward phase and similar upward movement time. Here, the initial force principle is most obvious, with a clear surplus in the red area for the acceleration impulse in the counter movement jump as compared to the squat jump in blue. However, as upward movement times in squat jumps being usually longer than in counter movement jumps, the effect of the initial force principle may be attenuated. In rare cases, and particularly in inexperienced jumpers, the squat jump may be executed with a clearly longer upward movement time, producing a larger acceleration impulse and thus a larger jump height than the corresponding counter movement jump, giving an upward movement in the same body posture.